focused on step 1 of SBTN. So in the last session, we just gave an overview of what SBTN is and where does step 1 come in that 5-step process. And in today's session, we will focus on step 1A, which is materiality screening. And these are the key objectives for this session. So at the end of this session, everyone should have maybe a list of their company activities. This is what Justin will take us through on how to determine the organizational boundaries and then get relevant activities from those that are concerned with that boundaries that we'll be setting. And then after that, we'll have Thomas van Viergen from ENCO or F-Link, who will take us through the materiality screen, the actual materiality screen. So there we will determine which of the activities have the potential to impact on the environment. So that's what materiality screening will be about. And we are just waiting for Thomas now, who will take us through that part of the second part of those objectives. And we have a really simple program for the day. It will be me first with a quick recap of what we did in the first session, and then Justin will help us with determining the organizational boundaries, and then Thomas with the materiality screening and some background on the database of the SBTN materiality screening tool. The SBTN materiality screening tool gets its data from ENCO, and yeah, Thomas will just talk to us about that database. And then we'll take a break and then we can come back with the practicals. I was hoping we'll have more people in the room and then we could do the practicals together. But that is also fine. As you are doing it, you can contact me between now and the next session on if you are struggling with some of those activities. And then we'll end by 12 by 1. All right. Any questions so far before we start with that quick recap? What's that? All right. Yeah, in the last session, we had Sophie Lacombe from SBTN just taking us through the SBTN process. So it is a 5-step process, starting with assess and then through to tracking your targets. But for purposes of this capacity building program, we are only focusing on step 1 of the program of the process. So in step 1, it's materiality screening that I've already mentioned. So each company will go through their value chain and identify their activities and identify those activities through the value chain that have material pressures to the environment. And in step 2, which comes later on, is where you start prioritizing which of the activities are you going to focus on, and then you set targets on the activities that you prioritized in step 2, that you do in step 3, and then you start acting on those pressures. Where you have material pressures, you start acting on them, and then step 5 will be monitor and verify. So step 1 is quite important because everything that follows from then comes from step 1. So we really need to get step 1 correct. And these are the objectives and the outcomes of step 1. So first is the materiality screening, and then you'll get the value chain assessment. So throughout your value chain, which ones of the pressures are material in your value chain? And this SBTN focuses on direct operations, so this is within your boundaries, and then upstream, this is where you are sourcing some of your products. So the focus for SBTN is only upstream and within your fence. There is no focus on downstream activities or where your products go after that. So the focus will just be that too. And then at the end of this step 1 assess, you should have a list of your activities, and from those list of activities, which ones are material or which ones have material pressures on the environment at the end. So I think at this point, if there are no questions, I'll hand over to Justin to take us through how we determine our organizational boundaries, and we start looking at how material are those activities to the environment. Should maybe for the guys online, since they haven't met you, you can just introduce yourself before we start.
Sure, thanks, Malaka. And I do know most colleagues here, I think. But yeah, for those I haven't met before, I'm Justine Bolton. I am at FirstRand in the Environmental and Climate Risk team. Very familiar with the carbon accounting side of this aspect, but I feel that I may be as informed or less informed than some of the others in the room and on the call. So happy to make this a more of a sort of a conversation and an exploratory presentation, and welcome your thoughts and inputs and even corrections if I'm getting things wrong. I think you can go to the next slide. There we go. So Malaka's already done a recap, but I wanted to just pause on this sort of overview and recap slide, just again to frame our discussion today. As Malaka said, you know, the step 1A is sort of the first stage in assessing the company's environmental impacts and identifying which pressures are most material. So it's quite an important step. I don't think it's the hardest step, but it does frame the work going forward. By setting your boundary, you're identifying what you're including in the analysis, where you could be looking for risks and opportunities. And I think also it's important when it comes to the end stage, when you've developed the targets, if you get this first step right, it does enhance and lead to accurate mapping and credible and defensible targets. So although I think it may be quite familiar, and it may be something that most companies have already done if they consider their greenhouse gas boundaries, it's important to understand why it's done, what the purpose is, and make sure that you've got the confidence in the boundary setting. Thanks. You can move on to the next slide. So why am I saying that? Why do boundaries and the activities matter? Firstly, you know, it's not just a technical exercise. It's a foundational step for accountability, for strategic alignment, and for credibility. In terms of accountability, what activities we identify in the boundary setting will lead to us understanding what are the environmental pressures that are caused by those activities, and what's included in, as Malaka referred to it, in our fence or in our boundary. It leads to an understanding of where these pressures occur. Is it in our direct operations? Is it in our upstream supply chain? So where it occurs in the boundary as well may influence how we're able to manage it. And why it matters is because it enhances risk identification. So it's not just a reporting step. By understanding where the risks are in your operations or supply chains, it leads to enhanced risk management and impact management, and where are those nature-related risks concentrated. I think these days conversations turn very much to opportunities as well. So I think it also speaks to opportunity mapping. Where can a company implement interventions or make changes or build resilience, or even enhance products or solutions that deliver the most benefit. And then it provides governance clarity, which part of the businesses need to act. Again, setting the boundaries defines the scope for action, which activities are in scope for nature target setting, which impacts are attributable to the organization, and which data must be collected for validation and reporting. Bearing in mind that in the second part of this presentation, Thomas is going to speak to materiality. So we're almost a step before that. We're just setting the boundaries and sort of listing all of the activities that could be included, and then we'll get to filtering it down in terms of materiality. So this is really an initial broad, high-level identification of all economic activities that may be material, and mapping and assessing the full value chain, after which the materiality lens can be applied. Again, this is just, it's beyond compliance. Why this process matters. We'll get into what kind of boundaries can be set, but the kind of boundaries define the influence and the responsibility that a company has. If you're in an operational control approach, you can identify where you can act on certain impacts. I think just maybe stick to the previous slide before I get there. Boundaries shape risk visibility. So, whether you, depending on what approach you apply, if you exclude lease facilities under a financial control, you may miss water stress or biodiversity risks in other parts of your operations that fall without that boundary. So choosing your boundary will determine what is in scope and what risks may be considered or excluded. Your boundary determination or the approach you choose could also enable strategic integration. It may allow you to link your nature targets with climate targets. So, for example, TNFD, CDP, transition planning, they may align with your carbon accounting approach. And so it would make sense that your nature accounting and science-based targets for nature approach aligns with that, so that your strategic integration is easier. And then, as mentioned before, your boundaries are a foundation tool for validation. Thanks. Next slide. So looking at the different greenhouse gas protocol approaches, and again, this may not be new to everybody, because these are what companies consider when looking at their carbon accounting and looking at their carbon footprints. So it would make sense, as I've mentioned, whatever you are already using for your carbon accounting, you would use for this approach as well. But it is useful to understand the difference between them, and the pros and cons. And it's not to say that one is better than another. It just, I think, depends on your organization and how you operate. So, for example, coming from a financial institution myself, we use the operational control boundary for our greenhouse gas accounting. That's because we have a lot of, we're sort of based more on a real estate model, I guess, and we have some leased buildings. So they're not perhaps under our financial control, but the impacts coming from them in terms of greenhouse gas emissions are under our operational control because we operate in those facilities. Therefore, we are responsible for the impacts coming from them. So for our business model, an operational control approach is appropriate. For perhaps the mining companies on the call or in the wider audience here, I was trying to think earlier, maybe a different approach is applied. Again, you'd know better than I would, but I would imagine maybe something like a financial control would be appropriate because your operations may be scattered, but they're all owned by the company, and it sort of enhances your consolidated financial reporting. So I'd actually, if you wouldn't mind just popping in the chat as well, if you know what your greenhouse gas accounting, your carbon footprinting approach is in terms of these different operational boundaries and what kind of company you have, pop it in the chat, and maybe it can also give us some insight into the type of approaches that different companies use. Again, there's no right or wrong. It just depends on the operating model of your company. And again, it's not like we're reinventing the wheel here. It's probably already been considered in your company when you're doing your carbon footprinting. The slides will be shared afterwards, so I'm not going to sort of read all the pros and cons, but it comes down to where you have influence. Does it align with your financial governance and reporting process? Could it be excluding or including activities or processes, for example, out of your maybe financial boundary, but in your operational control that could have a material risk. So these are all the kind of things that one consider when looking at your approach and what would be best used. If you haven't already set a approach for your greenhouse gas accounting for your carbon footprinting, it is probably then a worthwhile exercise to look at all these different approaches and say, okay, well, if I was to apply this to my company, so if I was to, for example, use the operational control approach, what would be in scope? And this probably links to the second part of my conversation. So then you would list all the business activities or your core activity and your upstream activities, and you'd understand what sectoral classification that would apply to that. And then you could do the materiality mapping to see, am I excluding anything with the boundary that I'm choosing that would actually be a material risk to the company or have a material impact on the environment? And should I then, which boundary should I choose, or have I chosen a boundary, but actually there's something that is outside the boundary that is material? So that's, I think, taking a step back if you haven't already set your operational approach, or your boundary approach. If you wouldn't mind going on to the next slide. Again, I've given some detail about the different approaches and what they are. So your equity share approach, this one confuses me a little bit. So maybe again, there's others on the call that have a better understanding. Maybe Thomas has a better understanding of this. But that's really, it's not sort of a wholly owned, wholly controlled company. It's more if you have equity or shares in other companies or other ventures, how do you then take responsibility for those? Again, First Rand uses an operational boundary for our own operation carbon footprint. It gets more complicated, I think, if we're looking at financed emissions, for example, because that's where, financial institutions have shares in other companies and other ventures. And where do you draw the line? Where do you start thinking, what is my responsibility to them, what isn't? I think generally a 40 or 50% share is material to then consider that approach. Again, it comes down to if you only have a 20% share in another venture, how much control do you have over those activities and those behaviors? So it depends on the nature of your business, and if equity share is something that your business is involved with, and then you'd have to consider, is this appropriate for me? Is it material to the business and my operations, and do I actually have a say over that approach? In my understanding, this approach is not that common. The other two approaches may be more common, but again, I think it depends on what kind of industry your business is in. Next slide, please. So this, as mentioned, I would imagine this applies to companies perhaps like mining companies or companies where they have direct financial control over their whole entities and a clear link to their upstream supply chain as well. The pros of this is it aligns with financial reporting standards, so it's quite easily to integrate your environmental accounting into your financial accounting because you're using same boundaries there as well. So it's easier, to integrate with your corporate financial disclosures. The cons, as mentioned, that you may miss certain operational impacts in entities that are not financially controlled, and it's less suitable for decentralized operational models. Again, it comes down to what kind of company and sector you're in and how your company operates. Next slide, please. I think I missed a slide there. So the operational control, that's I think where you have quite a decentralized business model. As I say, we've got leased assets, we've got partnerships. That we are responsible for. We're responsible for how they operate, where they operate. So therefore, we should be responsible for the impacts that they are causing. So that's how we take responsibility and accountability by using the operational control model. So but in doing that, all of our lease buildings we include in our carbon footprint, and therefore it would be the same when doing our science-based targets for nature. We'd need to consider them in our operations. I mean, there's other considerations when choosing a boundary or when understanding if the boundary approach that you've chosen is correct. Data availability being a big one. Some approaches require much more granular data in order to understand the impacts and the risks and set credible targets. So the equity share approach, I think, to try and get data from joint ventures, from partners, from other entities is often quite tricky. It also might be quite disaggregated. So data availability is a key consideration. Complexity of owner structures would obviously, understand how your business model works and what is that complexity and what would be the most appropriate approach. Regulatory and reporting requirements. Some sectors actually mandate specific approaches. Apparently, I'm not sure exactly which they would be. But if that is something that is applicable to your sector, then obviously that's the one you would need to use. But I think the main consideration, as already mentioned, is consistency with your greenhouse gas reporting that allows integration, alignment, consistency, clarity, and harmonization across all of your financial and natural capital accounting activities. Thank you. So now that you've set your boundary, you would obviously then need to understand, okay, well, what activities are in scope that my direct business activities and, as Malaka mentioned as well, considering upstream. So what are the upstream activities linked to your business that would fall within the boundary you've chosen? And Science-Based Target for Nature in their tool uses the ISEC codes, which is a sectoral classification system. There are different sector classification codes. ISEC code is quite common, I think, in some sectors, but other countries use different coding. You get SIC coding, you get NACE coding, you get G6, you get so many different types of coding. It depends on the jurisdiction you're in. It depends on what regulatory framework maybe you're requiring to, but essentially you can map from one to another. But ISEC coding, I think, is quite common, and it sort of underpins a lot of regulatory and reporting frameworks, both in South Africa and globally. Why do we do this, though? So by understanding the activity. So, for example, us as a financial institution, we would find the appropriate sector classification coding for financial institutions in that whole list of ISEC codes, and it would enable us then to understand what activities are associated with our sector and link those activities to environmental pressures. So it leads very much into the next part that Thomas will be taking us into, which is then looking at your materiality screening. So by identifying all the business activities and their sector codes, it enables that materiality screening. It also supports comparability and credibility. So if everybody in the same sector uses the same sector classification and undergoes the same materiality screening, science-based target setting, etc., even when it comes to environmental and carbon accounting, it just enhances that alignment, that comparability, and that credibility. Just want to see what else, if I've left anything else here. I think what I think will come out of the exercise of when you're doing this yourselves, one should consider obviously your sector that you're in, your kind of business you are. That I think will be quite easy to understand from a direct operations, direct risk and impact point of view. I think the upstream part might be a little bit trickier. More and more, the regulatory frameworks, the disclosure frameworks like IFRS S1 and S2, previously like TCFD, there's this bigger focus on your supply chain and your upstream and downstream activities. Downstream is obviously out of scope, as Malaka mentioned, for this exercise, but to understand where those risks and impacts lie in your supply chain, especially upstream, is very important from a nature point of view. It speaks to those who are familiar, I think, with TNFD. It speaks to that focus on dependencies and impact. So, you know, if you understand in your supply chain what are the dependencies on your natural capital, like raw materials, like water services, that's a huge part of risk management and building resilience in your own company and your operations. So by identifying what those activities in your supply chains are, by understanding then what sectors they're in, by looking at the ISIC coding. So say you've got a raw material supplier who is a nut producer, and your product that you manufacture depends very much on nuts. Then by including that sector classification in your analysis, you can then identify further down the road when we progress, what are the dependencies, what are the impacts, what are the risks and opportunities to my company based on those supply chain sectoral classifications. I think that kind of lends me to then handing over to Thomas in terms of the materiality screening, but it's just sort of making that link between now we've identified our boundary, we've identified the sectors that are in our direct operation and our supply chain, and we've identified the coding that comes from it. So now that we've got the coding and we understand, we can put it through this materiality screening tool, and that's where we're confident that we've considered everything that could be included. We're confident that any pressures that we need to assess are within that boundary. Now we can say, okay, well, what is actually material to our company in the location that we are, etc., and how do we narrow it down? So we started with this very broad, all-encompassing approach. Now we start narrowing it down to what is less or more material. I'm going to pause there for any questions before I let Thomas take the reins. Oh, go ahead.
Just thanks. That was very informative from my point of view. Just want to confirm that you say the downstream activities are not incorporated in this example, but in practice they will be, right? And they in turn will have the corresponding ISIC codes. Is that correct?
So as far as I understand, and Malaka, correct me, for SBTN, downstream is out of scope. I think that's so. We won't be doing it in this program at all. It's not in scope. I would imagine the reason for that is because downstream is very hard to manage in terms, like you've got very little control over what downstream, you know, if somebody's buying your product, if somebody's using it for another purpose, you've got very little control over what they can do with it. So you've got very little control over the targets that can be set. I think it applies similarly to, you know, carbon emissions, where you've got very little influence over the users of your products and services. So if you were to include them in your targets, you would have difficulty decarbonizing or reducing the environmental impact, etc. Although in terms of completeness from a carbon accounting point of view, that's where your scope 3 does come in, because there sometimes are material impacts, but I'm not sure if we're mature enough or have a better understanding of the data requirements or the levers to transition that would be required from a nature point of view.
Yeah, sorry, Malaka, that's for you. Yeah, just I think that was going to be my follow-up question around likening it to scope 3. But I think you answered my question there from a nature point of view. I do have another question, but I think I'll pause it for now. And if there's time, I'll come back and ask it. Thanks very much, Justine. Appreciate it.
No, Thanks, Justin, for that response. Yeah, it is correct on SBTN downstream. There's no focus on downstream activities. And then I think another important thing just to note from Justin's presentation is around getting data from other work that you might have done up to this point. So if you've done work on the greenhouse gas protocol or on your accounting, carbon accounting work, you already have set the organizational boundaries, and therefore you should have your economic activities. So you'll just start your SBTN step 1 process from where Thomas will start us now. So I think that is important on the resourcing side of things. I think a point that Martin raised in the previous meeting on resourcing for these activities, that where possible we are able to leverage data from other processes, we can bring it into this work. And also we gave an example with the greenhouse gas protocol, because that is what SBTN recommends using. And also on the approaches, they do recommend the operational control or the financial control, and not so much on the equity share approach. I think we are ready now with Thomas. Just please confirm on your end if you are able to see the slides. So please share your slides. Share on Teams.
Oh,
Yeah.
I think I'm battling there.
No. So the first task from what Justin just presented now would be task 1, where you will end up with a list of your economic activities. That is what we'll do in the practical side of things.
Teams, cool.
So share on Teams.
Screen.
All right. Maybe we can take some questions or some inputs while Thomas is trying to share his slides.
Garth, you had another question?
Yeah,
But
good.
please go ahead.
At the risk of hogging the floor here. Just, yeah, another question is, do you know whether the full range of your activities that you would be scoping out as part of that boundary setting would be folded into or found under the various ISIC codes? In other words, another way to answer it, do the various ISIC codes accommodate most, if not all, activities within your economic scope?
I'm not sure I quite understand.
So are there activities that you might come up with as part of your scoping that may not correspond or come in under a particular ISIC code?
Would be identifying sectors and business sectors. If you think of ISIC codes, I don't know how familiar you are with ISIC codes, but they've got like titles like manufacturing, and then it lists various activities or sub-industries under manufacturing, and then it's got agriculture. So I think you would have to maybe then do an exercise. If you have identified an activity and you're not quite sure, it doesn't have a certain classification, you would need to map it back to a subsector. So what subsector is that organization that is conducting that activity in? Because then that subsector, when you now map to the materiality, would then give you the risks and dependencies. So I think you might get some more clarity now in this example.
Yeah.
But I mean, you do often find in our financed emissions accounting, for example, you kind of have to do some matching up and aligning and sort of attributing different subsectors and sectors to a specific commodity or activity. So you might have to do some thinking, but there should be a classification for everything. It depends, who is conducting that activity and what subsector would they be in, and then you would sort of apply that classification accordingly.
Maybe just to add on to Justine, and we might cover it or not in the presentation, but I think it's what we found from a practical perspective is that within organizations, say banking institution, they would have a credit book, and some of the sector as well as subsector classification descriptions don't match up to the ISIC codes or GSIC codes or the NACE codes. So then you've got to use a little bit of intuition in terms of thinking, okay, so what are we going to bundle this into? So sometimes it's actually quite a mess to try and do a comparative internal organization, especially like a finance institution which have got multiple divisions. You've got RBB, you've got CIB, etc. And each one of them have got their own sort of classification system, and then to map that to an ISIC has been problematic at times with some of the work that we've done. I think what's quite a good position at the moment is for all institutions to go the ISIC route, because that's what the SARB is going for. So underneath the climate and related finance disclosure work that all the banks are currently doing, they're all aligning. So at the end of the day, it's going to be easy to compare apples with apples. But I think that kind of approach should be quite standard, I think, across all industry players and actors in getting to a point of standardization, because that just helps with the data analysis going forward, when we're doing things like country reporting, etc. So that we actually know, listen, when we're talking about the agri sector and we're talking about different types of subsectors, that we're actually talking about the same thing. It's been actually quite interesting because some of the classifications have been, the raising of buffaloes, etc. And there isn't an ISIC code for, or even a sub-industry code for things like raising buffaloes, but we've got, buffalo farmers in the country who are making a lot of money out of it. So, so that is interesting. So I'm going to run through. Okay, pleasure, Garth. So I'm just going to go through the SBTN's materiality screening tool. So I've got a lot of slides. There's a lot of content as well, a lot of text. So a lot of it I'm just going to gloss over. Malaka will share the slides with everybody on the call, because a lot of it is actually sort of like academic text which supports the MST in terms of what is the thinking around the application of certain aspects in it. So I'm not going to go into that in a lot of detail. Just structurally, what we're going to do is look at the tool itself overarchingly, and just some of the, I would say, key fundamentals around materiality and the way that the MST tool considers materiality. And then we're going to go into some of the underpinning and sort of a little bit of a deeper dive, maybe a little bit under the rabbit hole in terms of the science and other frameworks and tools, etc., which has supported or which the SBTN's MSTs actually developed upon, such as, in particular, we're going to be looking at the Encore tool and also looking at the references from MST to Encore, etc., and the support and the structures between that. So without further ado, I'm just going to look at what is materiality. So within the framework, materiality refers to environmental and nature-related pressures and corresponding dependencies. And Justine also spoke a lot about the boundaries. She spoke about pressures and the whole issue around dependencies, particularly when you're looking at upstream and downstream value chain aspects. That's where this whole issue around dependency actually becomes quite important. And to consider that those activities are significant enough to warrant setting a science-based target for nature. I suppose that is a discussion for different times, actually, to start understanding, how all these different reporting and disclosure frameworks and supporting science-based frameworks actually interplay with each other. And currently, it's actually quite a nice nestled or incestuous type of arrangement between TNFD, SBTN, ISSB, Encore, etc. They're all of these, what we're seeing is convergence of all these frameworks and reporting tools to a point that they're actually all starting to support each other and they're collaborating. So, which is really good news, because it just really reinforces and, supports this nature-related finance risk narrative going forward. And, the whole issue around establishing, targets, which this materiality assessment is part of a process of setting those targets. And that's for a later discussion within this core structure. So in effect, SBTN is looking at this double materiality lens. Currently, the work that we're doing with the International Sustainability Standards Board, unfortunately, has a single materiality lens. So there's definitely I would say, developmental pathway towards a consideration of these things in terms of double materiality, looking at impacts and dependencies. And then it also covers both companies' direct operations, as Justine alluded to earlier on. So your direct, if you're looking at your boundary, your direct operations, as well as your upstream value chain. And we'll obviously in time it will be a downstream value chain as well for nature-related pressures. So the materiality screening is actually the step one, the assess of the target setting process. And what's interesting, if you have to start comparing this process to the TNFD's disclosure process, you've got the LEAP assessment process, so locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare. The step one of SBTN will be equivalent to the E4 evaluates phase within the TNFD's LEAP framework. So a little bit of, I would say, semantic difference over here. When we talk about assess here, we're basically talking about the E phase in the TNFD. So just the 5-step process, and step one, the assess, and then the materiality screening. So we'll go into that. So this is really a high-level rapid screening of what your economic activities are, and to identify the in general potential material pressures on natures and pressures and dependencies. We bring that in. So the key tasks are the 5 tasks, and just in touch on organizational boundaries, identify direct operations, upstream activities, high impact commodities, and what we're looking at is task number 4, screen for materialities across 8 pressure categories, which we'll also have a look at. And then just to state the obvious again, the materiality screening tool is explicitly designed for this step, as illustrated over here. So what is a materiality screening? It's a quick high-level process where you identify whether your economic activities are material on those 8 pressure categories, and those 8 pressure categories have been defined by the OnCall tool, and we'll look at that as well. So this is the interface on the SBTN's materiality screening tool dashboard. I did not include the README because that's just a whole lot of text, but if you start looking at it, your full direct operations data set, your ISIC group. So SBTN is aligned to ISIC, and a bit later on in the presentation, I'll just allude to the differences that OnCall used that, because that was initially developed on GICS industry classification, and that has now been realigned in the latest OnCall update of October 2024 to the ISIC classification system. So similar to OnCall, we look at the sector. So a sector would be agriculture, your ISIC group is grain of perennial crops, and then your production processes or sub-industry activity or processes, it's now referred to in OnCall, would then be a further disaggregation of what the understanding around perennial crops would be, and that would be large-scale irrigated crops, large-scale rain-fed crops, etc., would form part of that classification. So in this selection process, so just having a look at my mouse, you would click in the box and it would give you options. You'd put in your ISIC group, click in this box, and that would then give you your production process. And once you have these two in, it automatically selects from the database the different aspects, and particularly production processes and material pressures that would be applicable to large-scale irrigated crops. So this is all highlighted as being of material, being highly material to that specific production process. Things such as freshwater use, soil pollutants, terrestrial use, water pollutants, and water use. So you'll see that this is really very much pressure-based And if those were all zeros, it would have meant that, it would not have been material to that activity. So really pressure-based, or what we originally referred to in the first phase of Encore as to being impacts, which we'll describe a bit later. I'm not going to go into this in any detail. This is just the technical summary of the content and rationale behind that data set. The second tab looks at your full upstream data set. Very similar process. You select your Isaac group, look at your production process, and then it brings that up with your HICL in a lot more detail in terms of the specific types of large-scale irrigated crops that those types of activities would, and the type of ecosystem services that they would be dependent on, and obviously impact on freshwater use again, soil pollutants, terrestrial use, the same list as what we've had previously. This is again just the detailed explanation behind that, and you're most welcome to read that at your leisure. The third tab is the crosswalk between the different codes. This is actually quite useful. Garth, I think coming back to your earlier question around the classification, so this should help to a certain extent in terms of aligning within large corporates who have got multiple exposures across diverse portfolios in terms of alignment of industry classifications between those, between GSIC, NACE, and Isaac. Just in terms of recent work that we've did on behalf of the SARB, we looked at 4 of its commercial banks, and also we actually went through an entire mapping process with regards to their various portfolios exposures in terms of trying to align the different industry subsectors that were classified in different, I would say, divisions or portfolios within the finance institution, so that we could compare the apples with apples approach and try and bring some kind of sensibility into understanding. And still, at the end of that process, it was still problematic. There was still a list of industry sub-processes that we couldn't map back logically to a formal code. So that then would require obviously a process of engagement with internal stakeholders within the organization in terms of understanding what that specific activity is, and then to get that then reclassified within the organization so that it fits into a larger contextualized classification system. So key features of the SBTN and materiality approach, like we said, it considers impacts first and dependencies second. It's based on 8 pressure categories. It looks at value chain, and as we said, particularly upstream coverage, and then spatial and geographic context matters. There's a whole issue around the validation milestones, etc. And then it's dynamic and iterative. So, materiality is actually the starting point in this journey. And I think, that as you progress through an understanding of what your materiality is, you can then start understanding what are these key metrics that we as an organization need to consider so that we can start considering target setting for those specific indicators. And that really, the understanding and the defining of those indicators really comes through I would say, a very strong, very rigorous materiality assessment process within the organization. And I'll show you how Encore can assist actually in giving you that deeper dive. So I really think that the SBTN materiality screening tool is actually that first key that you need to turn to unlock this process for yourself. Once you have that clear understanding, you can then take it further with more nuanced, more detailed tools. And obviously those tools capability also stop at a certain stage, and you then have to use really more fine and more nuanced applications to assist in that regard. So I think I've covered a lot of what I've just said now in terms of why is materiality central to the approach. So there's some practical implications for companies. I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail as well. Justine also touched on it with the aspect around, understanding what your internal boundaries are, your upstream operations, your upstream value chain, as well as organizational operations, etc. So something that you could go through. I'd like to get to the Encore knowledge base because I think there's some interesting narrative around that. So based on that aspect around the MST tool, Encore was one of the foundational, I would say, frameworks or tools to assist in that materiality aspect. And I just want to just go into a little bit of a deeper dive around Encore and materiality. So in essence, the materiality in Encore connects what we call natural capital dependencies and impacts to financial relevance. So it really asks the question, where could the degradation of nature or disruption of ecosystem services become financially material to a sector or asset? And I think this is a narrative that we've actually been harping on, I would say, for the past, since 2018, since Encore was actually launched. It was trying to, a very difficult application of trying to translate science-based and nature-related language into financial language, particularly in the finance sector in which we largely operated at that point in time. It was trying to bring this explicit link across, for credit analysts, etc., and financial analysts to really understand what was the financial risk between that dependency exposure. And within the Encore tool, we really see that it is the bridge between that ecological and the biophysical change and what that financial and business exposure looks like. And I think at a later stage, we could present some really interesting case studies where we've actually applied that. And I think there might be a slide in here which shows what that materiality ranking dashboard would look like, which actually becomes the very first step in understanding what that relationship looks like. But it's really all about understanding what materiality is. So Encore looks at along two axes. It's the dependency materiality. So, how essential is the ecosystem service to a sector's core operations? And if that dependency would be disrupted, what would that financial exposure look like? Would it impair production, increase costs, or reduce outputs, etc.? And we use this really, sort of like simple like example with agriculture, and I've got some agricultural examples through when we look at Encore with regards to water supply. So as a finance institution, you would be lending credit to a farmer. You have so on the dependency side, that farmer would be dependent on rainfall or irrigation for the success of that operation. And on the impact side is that abstraction or over-abstraction of that water supply, pollution of that water supply through agricultural runoff, etc., further impairs the ability and the success of that farmer to farm successfully, which would have direct financial consequences. And then ultimately, as a peripheral event, that farmer would then, production would go down, etc., and the inability to pay back that finance section of a loan, etc., would then expose the bank, to financial risk, notwithstanding the farmer himself. So it's this kind of thinking around impacts and dependencies and the materiality around that. So, I've actually used the same example now just to describe impact materiality. So to which degree does that sector's activity or the subsector actually alter or degrade and the underpinning and supporting ecosystem service that that supports that particular production process. And I think we start speaking about the systemic or transition risks, and I've got a slide further in here which talks about the prudential risk that comes out of understanding materiality, which is actually quite a nice spin to bring to this. Is that ultimately what this leads to is transition risks in terms of default on environmental authorizations or approval processes, etc., such as water quality related aspects, and ultimately, the contagion that I would say cascading effect of all of these kinds of events would ultimately have on a finance system or on a sector if that were. So you don't need to look at it at a GDP level only, but you can look at a domestic bank level or an industry type of level. So if we have extensive droughts over a certain sector of the country, it puts, as we've seen on numerous occasions, it puts significant pressure on a specific sector like agriculture, and then there's job losses, there's food price increases, etc. There's this current foot and mouth disease aspect as well, which speaks a little bit into physical risk, but also transition risk due to failure of policy in policing and implementation, has now led to an increased price with regards to to the beef price, which is quite interesting. I was at a restaurant in the week, and they had a little sticker on the menu that says, due to the foot and mouth disease, our beef, the dishes that contain beef have increased, so please do bear with us, or ask, the way for explanation why the prices have increased. So this is this kind of cascading effect, where it gets passed down further into the economy. So the way that Encore looks at materiality is interesting. I mean, and it comes back to this whole issue: is it science-based? Which is really the question that we've always got to ask ourselves in terms of being critical about how do we define indicators that supports these targets going forward. Materiality process assists in defining that, but I think in saying that, you also have to be circumspect in terms of the application and make sure that the frameworks and the tools that we are using are grounded in science. So I have also part of this material how can I say, a slide with a lot of detail in terms of where, when you talk about materiality in Encore, is it qualitative or is it quantitative? Is it a combination of qualitative and quantitative metrics? And exactly where do those metrics come from? So we do touch on that very shortly, just to illustrate, the scientific rigor that is behind these decision-making processes. So when we talk about materiality, you're looking at a dependency times the ecosystem service, and it is ranked within the tool on a 5-point scale from very low to very high. And these look at experts, like I said, an expert synthesis of biodiversity dependencies, critical input, etc., that has been added into the tool. And really, I think this tool visualizes which ecosystem services matter most to which sector. So it gives you that differentiation as well. You'll see from the MST as well, it goes down to a certain level of detail, and it's basically just an extrapolation of that level of detail, which the Encore tool then provides in giving you that finer granularity and nuanced view, specifically down to an ecosystem service and underpinning natural capital asset level, and the materiality rating for each of those natural capital assets which underpin the ecosystem services. So it goes down to quite a granular level, and it's at that natural capital asset level that you start identifying those types of indicators. So I didn't build this into this presentation, a couple of slides just in terms of what are ecosystem services, how do they function, what are they made up of. But essentially, if you have to think about an ecosystem service like water, the underpinning natural capital assets which supports that water ecosystem service are things such as sediments and soils, different types of species, etc. So you can go down to that level already and start understanding what those science-based targets are that you would need to define and select, which are appropriate to your specific economic sector. Some of the really low-hanging fruits, I think, in some of the latest SBTN publications around indicators are things such as water. We talk about water, it's water quality and water quantity. I think quite two metrics which are relatively easy to measure. When you start looking at more biodiversity-related aspects, I think it becomes a lot more complex and complicated. And I think that's where the tricky part of this, of the science-based targets networks work is in terms of trying to establish those and understand what they mean. And we did allude to this geographic sensitivity as my second bullet there. Really, nature is geographically unique. So every location is different from the other one. So when you're talking about this kind of materiality assessment, it's really important to have it at a local level understanding. You can get a sector-wise perspective, but really where your operations are located, and that specific interface with nature really is where the material aspects lie. Just looking more at ONCO, and I alluded to that earlier, it's very high, medium, low, etc. So if you look at that diagram, different different ecosystem services have different levels of materiality for specific production processes. And that you will also see when you start using the Encore tool and you go deeper down. And I always say, look at the high and the very high material aspects and focus on those. So in your assessments, you'll be able to identify those and for whatever sector it is. And those are the key aspects that you actually need to consider and unravel further. So this is what I alluded to earlier on, the financial supervisory relevance. So materiality is not just ecological, it's prudential, because it links the ecosystem degradation to sectoral production risk and exposure, which comes down to finite level of portfolio exposure and then financial materiality. And I've also discussed that a bit earlier. Depending on what sector you're in, also depends on large and where your operations are located, largely then obviously defines what your company's risk appetite is to certain of these things. And we do see movement with our finance regulator, and we're actually seeing some really interesting movement over the last week with our company's act regulator in terms of starting to understand this space. And starting to consider, further supervisory diagnostics and things such as stress testing. So it's not only for the banking sector; it is coming to a cinema near you. It's coming to a sector near you. And just further with that, I think if you look at different frameworks to support you on this journey, the TNFD is obviously the globally accepted norm at this current stage, and it's actually quite hot off the press from the ISSB. Had a board meeting last night, and I met with one of the board members after the meeting, and she said it is a go for biodiversity ecosystems and ecosystem services project. So it looks like the next phase of the ISSB's sustainability standards setting process is going to be considering nature-related financial disclosures. And so there's a very close collaboration with the TNFD. And then this once again speaks very deeply into the Global Biodiversity Framework's Target 15, which is focused at private sector disclosure of nature-related finance risk, etc., and looking at opportunities as well. So, we focus a lot on dependencies and impacts, risks and pressures, but similarly in saying that, it is the ability to, after you've done the target setting, after you've done your materiality assessments, to see what are those opportunities for business going forward. Where's the business case, which is also starting to emerge. I'd like to get to this part where I'll show you what the Encore architecture looks like. So it's almost like a bit of a roadmap. This will also be available to you. But just looking at the architecture, so this was the new development of Encore. We released this in October 2024, looking at your dependencies and your impacts, and then ecosystem services underpinning natural capital, your pressures, and what are those mechanisms of change in state, what then sort of a little bit of a feedback loop back into it. So this is a nice diagram just to illustrate, that it's been also been categorized and around, economic activities by ISIC. So just looking at the knowledge base, 2024, it's made out of sectors, production processes, ecosystem services, natural capital assets. There's drivers of environmental change, which we now call pressures, and then various types of impact drivers. So the database as of 2024, just a bit of background, and I think this is where the rigor of the different categories comes into play, is not that it was sucked out of somebody's thumb, but it's actually all of these, this hierarchy and this architecture can be traced back to science and underpinning scientific evidence upon which it has been built. This is just an illustration of how you would look at the previous MST categorization of agriculture and then production process, such as a large-scale irrigated crops, grading of rice, etc., and then just what those ecosystem services would be, underpinning natural capital assets, etc. So if you log on to www.encore.nature, I believe the website is, I have it at the end slide, you get to the Encore dashboard. It's free for everybody to use. It's a free resource. You just have to create an account, and then you can start exploring the tool. There's a button that says Get Started. That helps you to visualize the links between economic activities and then impacts and dependencies, as I've illustrated. And I'm going to be illustrating two aspects of the tool through slides and a little bit of a video demo, looking at both impacts and dependencies, and then the underpinning data, which is a separate tab which you can use to understand that. So this would then link back to that first block right at the top on the left, visualize links between economy and nature. So this is what the high materiality rating would be, and this is how you would do it. Your ISIC division, crop and animal production, growing of rice, and that would give you a Sankey diagram of the most material dependencies of that specific production process. So as you can see, water supplies is highly dependent on that. So looking at it, so that's dependencies. Now looking at impacts, so the issue around the volume of water used. So the first one was the ecosystem of water, and now the volume of water used, very similar process. You select the impacts tab, the same ISIC classification, and you would then get a different Sankey diagram which shows the volume of water used for that specific production process having very high materiality. And you can see how this links back to the MST tool, almost a logical transition from the one into the other. Then this is the underpinning data, so you can click on the data tab, and that would then really give you a whole lot of nuanced data with regards to what are those specific pressures. The materiality of those pressures gets described as well. So you can actually click on a further tab that goes to each of those different pressures and gives you an explanation of why it is material. If it's very low, it gives you that nuanced understanding as well. And also looks at the underpinning natural capital assets. As I said, it takes it right down to the lowest degree of ecosystem composition for you to understand, okay, we need to, and if we are operating in a specific area, these are the specific items that we need to start understanding that supports our production process. You're either dependent on it, or you're putting pressure on it, or there's a combination of both of those. It also has some spatial data layers in as well, which can be looked at. So just in terms of materiality assessment, again, materiality of dependencies, looks at materiality of impacts as well. Taking the Encore database, and the database is in a CSV file, so you can extract that data, put it into a spreadsheet, look at your different sectors. This was TNFD, a study done by TNFD, where they mapped the ecosystem services against SASB sectors to understand, what the materiality is. So from low to high again, and assets under management of a specific client. So that was in the asset management space. This is just what the Encore database looks like at the moment. So if you had to go into the backroom, so it's in a file, it's downloadable. So as you can see, the dependency materiality ratings, 06 and 07 pressure materiality ratings, CSV files, you can download that data, and you have the entire backroom engine to Encore that you can actually then do really nuanced and granular analysis with. Just some of the data out of the MST, just as the attribution and flag for users and future updates. So the MST does allude to the 2023 version of Encore that was used. So Encore has been updated, and that 2024 update will be integrated into the MST in time. So there's a partnership between SBTN and the Encore partners to update that data as well. Thank you very much. And there's my contact details if anybody would like to reach out, got further questions. So there's the website, www.encorenature.org, and it's free to use. Most welcome. Thanks, Manaka.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Thomas. Yeah, do we have any questions online? But yeah, I think just to emphasize on some of the things that Thomas has mentioned is the ISIS group on the MST. So on the MST, he didn't really go. I shared the MST link into the chat. What Thomas didn't do is just show that when you type the ISIS code for your activities, after typing it in the MST tool, it will pre-populate in the production processes what some of the production processes might be for you. And then another thing is that the MST tool is high level. It's high level. It just says whether, based on sector level data, whether that activity is material or not, but it does not rate the pressure coming out of that activity. So when you go further now into step 1B, which is what we'll do in the next session, is you can start now working to estimate the pressure levels with ENCO tool that Thomas just demonstrated now. So you can start saying, what is the pressure level that he just demonstrated now. But also beyond that, there's also the state of nature in that environment or in that particular region. So, for example, if you're extracting 100 megaliters of water at one basin, the pressure would not be the same compared to another basin in some region. So that's where it will start helping us with prioritizing where to set targets and where to start acting from. So, yeah. And the focus on ENCO is because the MST tool is developed from the ENCO database. So that is that logical transition that Thomas was referring to. So we are not trying to promote ENCO here, and we are trying to promote it. But yeah, it is, the database is coming from ENCO. Any questions? If there are no questions, I'm going to defer the break and just maybe demonstrate an example on the MST tool. Oh. So I think there are two tasks to complete here, which I'll just follow up with everyone in the group. You can see today we didn't have a big turnout, but I'll follow up with the rest of the group just to complete those activities before we have the next session. I'm guessing we'll have the next session in the new year, and by then I'm hoping that everyone would have completed their economic activities and would have come up with the sector level materiality screens for their activities. this is the interface that Thomas shared earlier. If you go to the full direct operations, so this is after the task that would have completed following Justin's presentation. So everyone would have their ISIS code and their economic activities. So I don't know, can we maybe get an example of a company? We spoke of growing buffaloes. So let's see, in the beef industry is cattle farming.
In Buffalo.
Let's go with the next. So once you select here, it will, and then you come to the production process, it will start pre-populating the activities related to that ISIC group. So is it large-scale crops? Is it livestock? So it's beef and dairy livestock. And then once you select that, it will just give you a list, and then you can download the list here. But there will be more than one activity related to that farming process. So you can select as many as possible here. So if you have mixed farming, you also have arable crops, you can add them. And it will start giving you what is material and what is not material. And from which pressure category. So the task here would be then to list your activities in line with the pressure categories, or which activity is material to which pressure category, and so forth. And like I said, this is the simplest part. And then in the next session, we'll talk about which ones are you going to prioritize on in the target setting process, because you're not going to act and prioritize on everything. So yeah, any questions up to here? So I'll follow up with everyone in the team on completing those tasks. And yeah, and then I'll also communicate going forward on the next steps and when will the next session be.
Sounds good.
Lovely. I think if there are no questions, I'm happy to leave it here so that we can focus on the homeworks. Like I said, I'll be following up with everyone, and then we don't take a break and then come back and continue with the practical.
Give us some time back to focus on our homework.
Yes, some time back to do the homework.
Appreciate
coffee.
Thank you.
Martin?
Yeah, no, very, very interesting, very informative. And yeah, I think it makes certainly more enlightening for me. It would help if you could just, I don't know, give us those links again. But I guess I'm being lazy. Just, maybe you're asking us to do stuff. If you could, any chance you could just give us a little to-do list, and then I'm very interested in exploring this a bit further. So not much in terms of the manual, but just a little bit of navigating, which would help. But yeah, it was a good session. I did learn a lot.
Thanks, Martin, and I'm happy that you got clarity from the materiality screening and materiality assessment. So you can see this one is high level and simpler to do. And yeah, I'll share the links and I'll share some of the guidance, and I'll just follow up to see how far we are before we set the third session. Because in the third session is going to be a bit more detailed, because you have to go now on estimating those pressures and looking at the state of nature where your operations are.
Yep, that would be awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin.
I think for today, Martin, now you need to rest. You sound like you need a bit of an R&R. Hope you feel better soon.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thank you. Appreciate it. Right. Cool.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Bye now.
Thanks, folks.
Joe.
Bye-bye.
Stop the recording.